To understand how the United States Navy almost defeated itself in 1944, you have to look at the devastating statistics coming out of Naval Air Station Pensacola in January of that year. On the surface, the war in the Pacific seemed to be going well. American fighter pilots were achieving kill ratios of approximately 3-to-1 against Japanese aircraft. By historical standards, that number was respectable. But the actuaries in Washington saw a looming disaster. Every single month, the Navy was losing an average of 147 pilots killed or missing in action. The training pipeline simply couldn't keep pace with that level of attrition. By late 1943, the Bureau of Naval Personnel projected that if those rates continued, the Navy would face a critical shortage of combat-ready aviators by mid-1945, precisely when the massive invasion of Japan was scheduled to begin. The math was terrifyingly simple. We were winning the dogfights, but we were slowly bleeding to death. The Navy's solution to this crisis followed the rigid conventional wisdom of military thinking. They decided to filter out the weak links. They established mandatory age limits, decreeing that any pilot over 35 years old would receive an automatic transfer to training commands or administrative duties. On paper, the reasoning appeared sound, backed by science and physiology. The prevailing belief was that younger pilots possessed faster reflexes, better eyesight, and superior stamina to handle the crushing physical demands of high-G combat maneuvers. Medical studies conducted right there at Pensacola seemed to confirm this, demonstrating that reaction times slowed measurably after age 30, while the ophthalmology department reported that visual acuity for distant objects declined steadily past the mid-20s. In the eyes of the medical board, a man in his late 30s was a biological liability in a cockpit. Admiral John McCain, the commander of Task Force 38, endorsed this policy without hesitation. In a February 1944 memo, he declared, "This is a young man's war." He argued that the Navy needed pilots with the physical capabilities to match the increasing performance envelopes of their aircraft. The Naval Aviation Medical Board agreed unanimously, stating definitively that pilots over 35 represented unacceptable risks in frontline squadrons. They weren't just seen as less effective, they were seen as a danger to themselves and their wingmen. The bureaucracy had spoken, and it had used science to justify a purge of its own ranks. But this policy created an immediate, self-inflicted crisis. By March 1944, the Navy had grounded 217 experienced combat pilots based solely on the date printed on their birth certificates. These weren't desk officers or soft training instructors. These were men with thousands of flight hours, multiple combat tours, and an intimate, hard-won knowledge of Japanese tactics. The Navy was grounding men like Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, who at 34 barely made the cutoff. A man who would go on to become the Navy's top ace with 34 kills, assuming they'd let him fly. They were grounding visionaries like Commander Eugene Valencia, whose mowing machine tactics would soon revolutionize fighter formations. And most critically, they were grounding Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thach. Born on July 19, 1905, Thach was turning 49 years old in the summer of 1944. Under the new regulations, he shouldn't have been anywhere near a cockpit. According to the Admirals' memo and the doctor's charts, he was washed up. He should have been pushing papers in Washington or teaching basic navigation to cadets in Corpus Christi. Instead, he was about to prove that every single assumption the Navy had made about age, reflexes, and combat effectiveness was catastrophically wrong. The system was obsessed with the physical attributes of youth, completely missing the fact that aerial warfare was evolving from a test of reflexes into a test of the mind. To understand why the United States Navy almost defeated itself in 1944, one must look past the propaganda reels and into the devastating statistics coming out of Naval Air Station Pensacola in January of that year. On the surface, the war in the Pacific appeared to be a success story. American fighter pilots were achieving kill ratios of approximately 3-to-1 against Japanese aircraft. By historical standards, this was respectable. But the actuaries in Washington saw a looming disaster. The math was terrifyingly simple. Every month, the Navy was losing an average of 147 pilots killed or missing in action. The replacement training pipeline simply could not keep pace with that level of attrition. By late 1943, the Bureau of Naval Personnel projected that, at current rates, the Navy would face a critical shortage of combat-ready aviators by mid-1945, precisely when the massive invasion of Japan was scheduled to begin. The Navy's solution to this crisis followed the rigid, conventional wisdom of military thinking. If you are losing too many men, you must filter out the weak links. They established mandatory age limits, decreeing that any pilot over 35 years old would receive an automatic transfer to training commands or administrative duties. The reasoning appeared scientifically sound. Younger pilots possessed faster reflexes, better eyesight, and superior stamina for the physical demands of high-G combat maneuvers. Medical studies conducted at Pensacola demonstrated that reaction times slowed measurably after age 30, and the ophthalmology department reported that visual acuity for distant objects declined steadily past the mid-20s. Admiral John McCain, the commander of Task Force 38, endorsed the policy without hesitation, declaring in a February 1944 memo that this is a young man's war. He argued that the Navy needed pilots with the physical capabilities to match the increasing performance envelopes of their aircraft. The Naval Aviation Medical Board agreed unanimously, stating definitively that pilots over 35 represented unacceptable risks in frontline squadrons. But this policy created an immediate, self-inflicted crisis. By March 1944, the Navy had grounded 217 experienced combat pilots based solely on their birth certificates. These were not desk officers. They were men with thousands of flight hours and intimate knowledge of Japanese tactics. The fallacy of this thinking crystallized in the figure of Lieutenant Commander John Thach. Born in 1905, Thach turned 39 in the summer of 1944. By the Navy's new metrics, he was a liability who belonged in a classroom in Corpus Christi, not a cockpit in the Pacific. When Thach arrived at the Fighter Direction School in Quonset Point, Rhode Island in April 1944, he did not look like a revolutionary. At 5'9" and 160 pounds, with wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose for reading, he resembled an accountant more than a fighter pilot. His medical file was a litany of disqualifications. It noted chronic back pain from a training accident in 1932 and vision that required corrective lenses for close work. He was balding and walked with a slight limp from a carrier landing that went wrong in 1938. Everything about his physical profile screamed obsolete to the medical examiners. However, the doctors were measuring reflexes when they should have been measuring intellect. While other pilots focused on aircraft performance and individual dogfighting skills, Thach obsessed over mathematics and geometry. He filled notebooks with diagrams, calculating angles of attack and relative velocities. The Navy saw a man with slow eyes. They failed to see a mind that was analyzing aerial combat with the intensity of a chess grandmaster.
Jimmy Thach was the antithesis of the Hollywood fighter pilot. In April 1944, stationed at the Fighter Direction School in Quonset Point, Rhode Island, he looked less like a warrior and more like an overworked actuary. He stood 5'9" and weighed 160 pounds, often peering over a pair of wire-rimmed glasses he needed for reading. His medical file was a catalog of wear and tear. Chronic back pain from a 1932 training accident, visual acuity issues requiring corrective lenses for close work, and a balding pate that betrayed his 39 years. He even walked with a subtle limp, a lasting souvenir from a carrier landing that had gone wrong 6 years prior. By every conventional metric of the U.S. Navy, Thach was a depreciating asset. But while the medical boards were measuring his diastolic pressure and reaction times, they failed to account for the one organ that hadn't aged, his brain. Thach possessed a capability no eye chart could measure. He did not see aerial combat as a test of reflexes, but as a problem of geometry. While his younger counterparts spent their off hours boasting about individual dogfighting skills and aircraft horsepower, Thach spent his time filling notebooks with diagrams. He obsessed over angles of attack, relative velocities, and firing solutions. This analytical nature was born of necessity. Growing up in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, he hadn't been a natural aviator. He had initially been rejected from flight training due to poor depth perception, and had only passed on his second attempt after months of rigorous eye exercises. He had to think his way into the cockpit, and now he was thinking his way through the war. The breakthrough happened on a Tuesday afternoon over Narragansett Bay. Thach was observing two student pilots in F-6F Hellcats practicing standard dogfighting maneuvers. He watched as one plane pursued the other in a classic tail chase. The pursuing pilot held every advantage: altitude, speed, and position. The target pilot attempted the textbook Navy escape maneuver, a hard brake turn followed by a climb, but it failed miserably. The pursuer stayed locked on, simulating a kill. In that moment of failure, Thach's mind inverted the image. He stopped seeing two individual planes and started visualizing a system. What if instead of running away from the attacker, the target pilot turned toward his wingman? What if the two aircraft operated not as individuals, but as a single interlocking defensive unit? He envisioned a scissoring motion, a weaving pattern where each pilot covered the other's tail. It was a radical departure from the lone wolf mentality of fighter aces. It was collective survival based on math. Thach rushed to his workshop, a borrowed hangar at Auxiliary Field 2, and recruited a skeptic, Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare. O'Hare was a legend, a Medal of Honor recipient, but even he struggled to grasp the concept Thach was sketching out. He called it the beam defense position. It required two friendly aircraft to fly directly at each other at a combined closing speed of 600 miles per hour. The theory was insane. When an enemy fighter locked onto one American plane, the two Americans would turn toward each other. As they crossed paths, the free fighter would have a perfect deflection shot at the enemy pursuing his wingman. The enemy pilot, focused on his target, would suddenly find himself flying across the nose of a second Hellcat with its guns blazing. But the margin for error was non-existent. A miscalculation of half a second meant a mid-air collision that would kill both American pilots instantly.
The first live test took place on May 18, 1944, at 0600 hours. Thach and O'Hare took their Hellcats up to 10,000 feet over the Atlantic. On their fourth attempt at the weave, disaster nearly struck. O'Hare's aircraft passed less than 15 feet beneath Thach's fuselage. The buffer was so thin that both pilots felt the violent shudder of the other's prop wash. They landed in silence. For 5 minutes, neither man spoke, the gravity of the near-death experience settling in. Then O'Hare looked at Thach and said simply, "Again." Over the next 2 weeks, they flew 17 more practice sessions. They treated the sky like a blackboard, refining the angles and developing hand signals to coordinate the turn. They drilled until the terror of the head-on pass was replaced by instinct. By early June, they could execute the weave blindfolded, maintaining perfect spacing through nothing but trust in geometry. Thach had his solution. Now he just had to convince the Navy that his suicide pact was actually the key to survival. On June 12, 1944, Jimmy Thach formally submitted his tactical manifesto to the Bureau of Aeronautics. He titled it, "A Mutual Support Tactic for Fighter Aircraft Operating Against Superior Enemy Numbers." It was a dry, academic title for a concept that was effectively a declaration of war against naval tradition. The response from Washington was swift and brutal. Just 4 days later, Thach received a single-page letter from Captain James Russell, the chief of the Fighter Tactics Section. The letter didn't just reject the idea, it dismantled it with the cold language of doctrine. Russell wrote that the maneuver violates established doctrine regarding safe aircraft separation and required an unrealistic level of coordination. Most damning of all, Russell noted that the tactic abandoned the fundamental principle of pursuit geometry. The letter concluded with a personal sting that had nothing to do with aerodynamics. Given Thach's age and medical profile, the Bureau recommended he limit himself to administrative duties. The message was clear: leave the flying to the young men. Thach, however, refused to be grounded by a memo. On June 20th, he found himself in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the Navy Department building in D.C., facing 27 officers. Captain Russell presided at the head of the mahogany table, while Thach sat alone at the opposite end, his diagrams spread out before him. He was given 15 minutes to present his case.
He barely made it through 3 minutes before the room turned on him. Commander Harold Stassen, a tactics instructor from Pensacola, couldn't hide his disdain. That's not tactics, that's a recipe for killing your own wingman. When Thach argued that he had flown the maneuver successfully 43 times, Russell countered that he had only flown it against Americans who knew the choreography. The Japanese won't cooperate with your choreography, Russell snapped. The debate quickly shifted from geometry to ad hominem attacks. Russell's voice dripped with contempt as he pointed to the elephant in the room. "Commander, with all due respect, you're 38 years old. You wear reading glasses," he said, noting that Thach hadn't flown a combat mission in 2 years. The room erupted in agreement. Officers began questioning whether Thach was even current in the F-6F Hellcat, suggesting his judgment was clouded by age. The consensus was building. Thach was an obsolete pilot trying to rewrite the Bible of aerial combat with scribbles from a notebook. Then a voice cut through the chaos. "Gentlemen, shut up." Vice Admiral John McCain stood in the doorway. At 59 years old, McCain himself exceeded the Navy's age limits for combat command, yet he led Task Force 38, the most powerful naval aviation force in history. The room fell silent as the weathered admiral walked to the center. He turned to Thach. "I've read your paper 3 times. I have one question. Does it work?" Thach didn't flinch. "I would stake my life on it, sir. In fact, I'm asking for permission to do exactly that."
McCain turned his gaze to Russell and asked for the casualty reports. When Russell confirmed that the Navy had lost 147 pilots the previous month and that 70% of those deaths resulted from enemy fighters achieving a tail position, the argument was over. McCain realized that Thach's dangerous maneuver addressed the exact cause of the slaughter. "Captain Russell, your objection is noted. Your recommendation is overruled," McCain declared. He authorized Thach to form a hand-picked 4-plane test squadron and deploy immediately to the Pacific. As the meeting adjourned, McCain offered one final warning to the man he was betting on. "Commander, don't make me regret this." The blackboard sessions were over. The arguments in the conference rooms of Washington, D.C. were thousands of miles away. At 0847 hours, Jimmy Thach taxied his F-6F Hellcat onto the flight deck, followed by his hand-picked test division. Lieutenant J.G. Richard May, Ensign John Carr, and Lieutenant Howard Burris. They were flying combat air patrol over the task force, a routine mission that was about to become the final exam for Thach's controversial theory. At 0923 hours, the radar operator shattered the calm. Bogies were inbound. 12 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters approaching from the northwest at 15,000 feet. These weren't the green, untrained cadets the Americans had been slaughtering in the Turkey Shoot earlier that year. These were veterans of the 253rd Air Group, experienced hunters who had collectively downed 47 American aircraft. The math was grim. 4 Americans against 12 Japanese aces, a 3-to-1 disadvantage. By all conventional tactical doctrines, that should have been dead before he even started. The Japanese commanders saw the small American formation and ordered an immediate attack, splitting their force into high and low groups to sandwich the Hellcats. It was the standard hammer and anvil tactic that had killed hundreds of U.S. pilots. Thach watched them come. He didn't panic. He calculated. He waited until the Zeros committed to their dive, locking onto their targets. Then he keyed his radio. "Weave on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Mark." The 4 Hellcats instantly split into 2 pairs. Thach and May formed the first element. Carr and Burris formed the second. Instead of breaking away to escape the diving Zeros, the instinctive survivalist move every pilot is taught, the Americans turned toward each other. To the Japanese pilots, the maneuver looked like madness. From the cockpit of Zero, it appeared as though the Americans were attempting a clumsy formation change, or worse, were on a collision course with their own wingmen. Saburo Sakai, a legendary Japanese ace who survived the war to write about this encounter, described the sheer confusion that gripped the attackers. "The American aircraft crossed in front of each other in a pattern I had never seen," Sakai recalled.
Sakai selected a target, likely Thach or May, and initiated his attack run. He had the speed, the angle, and the element of surprise. But as he closed in for the kill, the geometry of the battle shifted violently. The target's wingman suddenly appeared in his gun sight, flying perpendicular to his line of attack. guns blazing. The hunter had become the hunted. Sakai was forced to break off his run to avoid being shredded. He circled back, repositioning for a second pass, expecting the Americans to have scattered. Instead, they were still there, weaving back and forth in a hypnotic figure-8 pattern. When I repositioned for another pass, the pattern had shifted again, Sakai wrote. It was like trying to shoot ghosts. The Japanese pilots found themselves trapped in a mathematical grinder. Every time a Zero committed to a tail chase, they were led directly across the nose of the other American fighter. The beam defense position turned the Japanese aggression against them. The Hellcats were alternating seamlessly between being the bait and being the shooter. The Japanese achieved 0 first-pass hits. They were on the defensive, dodging 50 caliber rounds instead of pressing their advantage. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. In the world of aerial combat, that is an eternity. When the sky finally cleared, the results of Thach's kitchen table geometry were floating in the Philippine Sea. 4 Japanese Zeros had been shot down. 8 others were damaged and fleeing back to their base. And the Americans? Thach's division suffered 0 casualties. Dick May's aircraft had taken 3 bullet holes in the tail section, a minor souvenir from a desperate enemy. That was the extent of the damage. The kill ratio was 4-0. Thach had proven that a 39-year-old man with bad eyes and a notebook could outfly the best aces of the empire. The obsolete pilot had just changed the future of naval aviation. But the Japanese were quick learners. 3 days later, they would return with 21 fighters, determined to break the weave. They assumed the first time was a fluke. They were about to find out it was a system. By April 1945, the war in the Pacific had descended into a horrifying, grinding attrition. The clean, blue-water duels of Midway were a distant memory. Now, off the coast of Okinawa, the United States Navy faced a threat that defied all conventional logic: the kamikaze. The Japanese High Command, realizing they could not match American pilot training or industrial output, had turned their aircraft into guided missiles. They launched Operation Kikusu, floating chrysanthemum, throwing waves of suicide planes at the invasion fleet. This brings us back to where our story began, March and April of 1945, with the radar screens glowing white with incoming bogies. The defense of the fleet did not rely on the reflex-based dogfighting of 1942. It relied on a defensive wall of fighter aircraft, and the architect of that wall was the very man the Navy had tried to force into retirement. Jimmy Thach was now 40 years old. By the standards of the 1944 medical boards, he was a geriatric case. His medical files still listed chronic back pain, and he still required reading glasses to check his instrument panel. In a young man's war, he was an ancient relic. Yet, as the Japanese unleashed the largest aerial offensive in history, Thach strapped into his cockpit not as an administrator, but as the deadliest predator in the sky. The week of April 6th through April 12th, 1945, stands as the single greatest individual performance in the history of aerial warfare. It was the old man's masterpiece.
The Japanese strategy relied on overwhelming numbers. They believed that if they threw enough aircraft at the American fleet, the defenses would fracture. But they hadn't accounted for the multiplier effect of the Thach Weave. By April 1945, Thach wasn't just flying the Weave. He had taught it to the entire fleet. Every fighter squadron defending the invasion force, hundreds of pilots, was operating according to the geometry Thach had scribbled in a notebook in Rhode Island. The result was a slaughter. The Japanese pilots, often inexperienced and fixated on their suicide runs, found themselves flying into a meat grinder. When they attempted to engage the American Combat Air Patrol, they couldn't latch onto a tail.
If they targeted one Hellcat, another crossed their path with guns blazing. The Weave neutralized the numerical advantage of the enemy by maximizing the defensive firepower of the Americans. But the most shocking statistics came from Thach himself. The Navy had argued that older pilots lacked the stamina for sustained combat. They claimed reaction time slowed with age. Thach responded by flying sortie after sortie into the densest anti-aircraft and fighter environments of the war. He didn't just survive, he dominated. In those 7 days alone, between April 6th and April 12th, Jimmy Thach personally shot down 27 enemy aircraft. Let that number sink in. 27 aircraft in 1 week. Most fighter aces spent entire wars trying to reach 5 kills to achieve ace status. Thach destroyed 5 aces worth of enemy planes in 168 hours. It is a record that has never been broken. It is a record that will likely never be broken given the nature of modern warfare. The man who was too old to fly was averaging nearly 4 kills a day. He was doing this while battling the G-forces that were supposed to break his aging body, and the visual demands that were supposed to be too much for his eyes. He wasn't winning because he was faster. He was winning because he was smarter. He was winning because he had turned the chaotic, adrenaline-fueled panic of a dogfight into a cold, predictable equation. The broader impact of his presence was even staggering. During that same 7-day period, American fighters defending the fleet shot down a total of 587 Japanese aircraft. The American losses were 43 aircraft. That is a kill ratio of 13.6 to 1. Compare this to the 3-to-1 ratio that terrified the Navy back in 1944. The difference, the bloody struggle and a decisive turkey shoot, was largely the result of one man's refusal to accept the dogma of his superiors. The Japanese pilots, committed to dying for their emperor, were unable to maneuver effectively against the defensive pairs. They were met by a wall of disciplined, weaving fire. Thach had turned the defensive liability of being outnumbered into an offensive asset. As the smoke cleared over Okinawa, the narrative of the young man's war lay in ruins. The most effective fighter pilot in the Pacific theater wasn't a 20-year-old with eagle vision and nerves of steel. It was a 40-year-old with a bad back and a brilliant mind. Thach had proven that innovation matters more than biology. He proved that experience wasn't a weight to be shed, but a weapon to be wielded. The obsolete pilot had not only secured the skies over the invasion fleet, he had fundamentally embarrassed the bureaucracy that tried to ground him. He didn't just rewrite the record books, he rewrote the definition of what a warrior looked like.
When the week ended, Thach landed his aircraft, stiff and exhausted, having personally accounted for more destruction in 7 days than entire squadrons achieved in months. He had delivered his answer to the medical board, not in a memo, but in burning wreckage strewn across the Pacific Ocean. September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay, as General Douglas MacArthur signed the formal instrument of Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri, ending the bloodiest conflict in human history. Jimmy Thach was watching from 3 miles away on the flight deck of the USS Lexington. He was a commander now, decorated with the Navy Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Legion of Merit. But while the cameras flashed and the history books were written, Thach remained in the background. In the years that followed, he refused every request for an interview. He declined to write his memoirs. When NBC asked to feature him in a documentary, he said no. His reasoning was as sparse and pragmatic as his tactical diagrams. I just did my job. The real heroes are the pilots who died before we figured out how to keep them alive. But the ledger of history tells a different story. The Navy calculated that between September 1944 and August 1945, the Thach Weave saved an estimated 1,847 American pilots. That number is abstract until you read the letters sent to Thach in 1946 by Lieutenant Robert Winston. Winston wrote, "Sir, I was shot down 3 times. Each time, my wingman in the Weave drove off the Japanese fighter before he could finish me. I have 2 daughters now. They exist because you refused to accept that you were too old to fight.
That is the true legacy of the obsolete man. It isn't the 27 planes he shot down in 1 week. It is the 1,847 fathers, sons, and husbands who came home to live their lives because one man looked at a problem differently. Thach retired as a full admiral in 1967 and passed away on April 15, 1981, at the age of 75. His obituary in the New York Times was a mere 147 words. It didn't mention that his tactics were used by F-15 pilots in Desert Storm to achieve a perfect 36-0 kill ratio. It didn't mention that he had changed warfare forever. But the pilots remembered. At his funeral at Arlington National Cemetery, 237 former Navy aviators stood in the rain to salute him. Captain Michael Harris, a 72-year-old survivor of the Pacific Air War, delivered the eulogy. He summed up the lesson that the bureaucracy had missed in 1944. He was told he was too old, too slow, too obsolete. He proved that wisdom beats youth, that thinking beats reflexes. He taught us that the most dangerous thing in warfare isn't the enemy. It's the assumption that we already know everything. Jimmy Thach proved that the experts were catastrophically wrong. And he did it not despite his age, but because of it. The next time the world tells you that you are past your prime, remember the man in the reading glasses who saved 2,000 lives with a notebook.